Kazakhstan's GDP per capita is $14,000. Russia's is $15,145. That gap, just over $1,000, is the smallest it has ever been since both countries became independent in 1991. If current growth trajectories hold, Kazakhstan will overtake Russia within this decade. A country of 19 million people surpassing a nuclear-armed nation of 144 million on the metric that matters most to ordinary citizens: income per person. Here's the data that explains how this happened and why almost nobody in the West is paying attention to it. When Kazakhstan declared independence in December 1991, it faced arguably the most difficult starting position in the entire Soviet succession. The Kazakh SSR had served as the Soviet Union's primary nuclear testing ground for 4 decades. The Semipalatinsk polygon, a region the size of Belgium in northeastern Kazakhstan, had absorbed 456 nuclear explosions between 1949 and 1989. The land was contaminated. Populations living near the test sites showed cancer rates and birth defect rates dramatically above Soviet averages. Kazakhstan also inherited the Aral Sea crisis, one of the largest man-made environmental disasters in recorded history. The Soviet Union had diverted the rivers feeding the Aral Sea for cotton irrigation across Central Asia. By 1991, the sea had shrunk to less than half its original size. Fishing communities that had existed for centuries had collapsed. The exposed seabed was generating toxic salt storms that contaminated agricultural land across the region. GDP per capita in 1991, approximately $1,400. By every standard metric, Kazakhstan was positioned to fail. Kazakhstan sits above some of the largest hydrocarbon reserves ever discovered. The Tengiz field, the Kashagan field, and the Karachaganak field together hold estimated reserves of 30 billion barrels of oil and significant volumes of natural gas. But what separated Kazakhstan from every other resource-rich post-Soviet state was not the existence of those resources. It was the country's geographic position, which forced it to be strategically intelligent about those resources rather than simply extracting and selling them. Kazakhstan is completely landlocked. To export oil, pipelines are required. Those pipelines must cross either Russia, China, or cross under the Caspian Sea to reach European markets. This geography, which looks like a weakness, functioned as a strategic forcing mechanism. Kazakhstan could not afford to alienate Russia. It needed the northern pipeline corridor. It could not afford to alienate China. It needed the eastern corridor. And it actively courted Western oil majors to develop the fields, because Western capital and technology were the only way to extract at the scale these fields required. The result was a multi-vector foreign policy that no other former Soviet state has managed to sustain. Russia extracted oil through state-owned companies and locked out Western majors. Kazakhstan extracted oil with Chevron, Shell, ExxonMobil, and dozens of smaller companies participating under production-sharing agreements that kept foreign capital flowing continuously. The strategic difference between nationalizing your oil industry and welcoming foreign equity is not ideological. It is practical, and the data shows exactly what difference it made. $370 billion. That is the cumulative foreign direct investment Kazakhstan has attracted since 1991. To understand the scale of that number, it exceeds the combined foreign direct investment of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Turkmenistan over the same period. It represents roughly 1.5 times Kazakhstan's current annual GDP invested in the country over 33 years. Kazakhstan's strategy for attracting this capital was not simply political stability. The country has had authoritarian governance since independence. The strategy was predictability, contracts honored, profits repatriatable, disputes resolvable through English common law arbitration rather than Soviet-era court systems. Kazakhstan built the Astana International Financial Center specifically to provide that legal framework, operating under English common law with independent arbitration in a jurisdiction that foreign investors could trust. It signed bilateral investment treaties with more than 50 countries. It created special economic zones with tax incentives structured to attract specific industries. None of this institutional infrastructure existed before 1991. All of it was built from scratch, within the constraints of a political system that was simultaneously authoritarian. The coexistence of authoritarianism and functional economic institutions is one of the central paradoxes of Kazakhstan's data story, and we will examine it directly rather than avoiding it. Perhaps the most striking single number in Kazakhstan's economic record is the poverty rate. In 2001, 49.5% of Kazakhstan's population lived in poverty, nearly 1 in 2 people in the country. By 2021, that rate had fallen to 8.5%. 5.9 million people moved out of poverty in 2 decades. That scale of poverty reduction, sustained over 20 years, is historically unusual. It required oil revenues to be channeled into public investment, infrastructure, education, healthcare, rather than captured entirely by elites. The National Fund of Kazakhstan, a sovereign wealth fund established in 2000, has accumulated over $60 billion in assets and functions as a buffer against commodity price volatility. When oil prices collapsed in 2014 and again in 2020, Kazakhstan could draw on the fund rather than imposing austerity. Russia, which had a similar fund structure in its National Wealth Fund, used that fund to cover war costs after 2022 rather than economic stabilization. The different use of oil savings tells you something important about institutional priorities in the two countries. In 2023, analysts at Eurasianet published data showing that Kazakhstan's GDP per capita trajectory was converging with Russia's at an accelerating rate. Two forces are driving this convergence simultaneously. Kazakhstan's economy is growing at 6.2% annually, driven by oil revenue, diversification into manufacturing and services, and continued strong foreign direct investment. Russia's economy is growing at approximately 3.2%, but that growth is heavily distorted by military spending that now represents 7% of GDP. Military spending shows up in GDP calculations, but does not improve living standards for ordinary citizens in the way that investment in productive capacity does. Additionally, Russia's 2022 brain drain, an estimated 800,000 people departed in the months following the invasion, removed productive workers, entrepreneurs, and knowledge workers from the Russian economy. Many of them relocated to Kazakhstan, which has benefited from an influx of Russian human capital while simultaneously gaining from Russia's difficulties. When the country you might overtake is actively harming itself, convergence accelerates. Kazakhstan's story is not a story of democracy. Its political system concentrates power, restricts opposition, and controls information. But the economic development record is real, measurable, and documented in World Bank and IMF data. The question the data forces is whether sustainable, long-term prosperity can be built on a foundation of authoritarian institutions, or whether the political constraints will eventually limit the economic potential. The answer to that question is not yet in the data. We will track it as it develops. Subscribe to the Collapse Index. New data every week.